The bedrock of democracy is freedom of speech. But it's not very good news. We are not the majority in the European Parliament that we want freedom of speech.
Words and ideas are weapons, and the European liberals are here to save us from that. And this is where the European Union's 17th set of sanctions comes into play. Because what you have here is sanctions targeting disinformation. Now, what was this disinformation? And who were these people? Now, a few of them were actually Russians, but there was also a German blogger, and there was a Turkish citizen who was a valid EU resident who was also sanctioned. And let's look at this case, because in that case we have a person who's been subjected to an asset freeze and a travel ban on the basis that he was systematically spreading information which the EU said was false. They said he provided pro-Palestinian protesters with an exclusive media platform. But what it looks like is a person who was documenting German police crackdown on Palestinian protests, and in retaliation, the German authorities slapped them with an EU sanction. And if you're targeted by an EU sanction, you don't hear the charges against you, you don't get a trial, you don't get a right to defence. You basically, the first thing you find out about this is a letter coming in your door telling you that your bank accounts have been frozen and that you're banned from entering or leaving the country. This is not just about speech. You mightn't care about whether someone was silenced for pro-Palestinian speech or whatever. That's not really important. You don't have to agree with the issues there, but you have to recognise the danger of what's going on here. Because if it's them today, it's you tomorrow.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our seminar, The New Repression, Democracy and Disinfo Policy. My name is Ondřej Dostál. I am a member of European Parliament from the Czech Republic, and I have some good news and a few bad for all of you. I'm glad we are having lots of guests, both from my country and from international area, so this will be very well represented. I have with myself Mr. Fidias Remarks, a member of European Parliament from Cyprus.
Come on, not mister, I'm 25 years old.
Well, he takes it really seriously, as you can see from his outfit, having no hoodie and having this Nike black
Not
shirt.
sponsored.
It is... Well, it is basically black tie dress for Fidias. So I think he will be a big, good moderator for our event. We have also wonderful guests. We have Andrew Lowenthal, founder of the LiberNet. Hello, Andrew. And we also have Clare Daly, who survived not only her recent visit to Yemen, but also survived 5 years in this parliament, which is a wonderful feat, being bombed on both occasions, metaphorically and non-metaphorically, by lots of other people. So I hope... Hello. So... Please, I'm really glad we have you in here, and thank you for your peace and free speech efforts in your past mandate.
Hello, guys. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Fidias Remarks. I'm a member of the European Parliament, the youngest man in the European Parliament. And I just want to set the stage for this kind of event, because my responsibility is to keep, as a moderator, is to keep things a lot more fun, a lot of fun. So I will kind of try to moderate the conversation and ask some questions to dump down the conversation a bit, because I need to be able to understand as a YouTuber, and because this will be uploaded in social media, we want everyone to understand. I'm in Democracy and Shield Committee. The bedrock of democracy is freedom of speech. So that's why we're here. It's very important, and I'm very happy to be here.
And now it is a good time to introduce Clare Daly. It is not necessary because everybody in this house already knows Clare Daly. She is from Ireland, a campaigner, activist, trade unionist who served as a local councillor from 2000 and then as a national MEP in Ireland from 2010. And she already had a formidable reputation of an opposition legislator, winning many policy victories and taking the Irish government to account. During COVID and during the past tenure in Parliament, you held European bureaucracy to account with a great success, and I hope you will tell us more about the nice or less nice things which happen here in Europe. Thank you, Clare.
Well, thanks very much, I suppose, first and foremost, to everybody for being here, some old faces, some new, but a special thanks to Ondřej for organising and for Fidias for being here, because we meet at a very dangerous juncture in world history when very few people at European leadership level, either in member states or here in these European Union bodies, understand the scale of the repression which is undermined and ongoing at the moment, let alone are prepared to do anything about it. So we are extremely grateful to Ondřej for organising this event, and we're very lucky that he is here. And
let's give it up for Ondřej.
In this building, a couple of weeks ago, downstairs, the Irish Commissioner, the main man, Michael McGrath is his name, he's responsible for rule of law in the European Union, and he addressed the plenary session of the European Parliament. And he told MEPs on that day that democracy is the founding value of the European Union, together with respect for rule of law and fundamental rights. He told them that freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, and the right to participate in democratic life are enshrined in EU treaties, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, EU legislation, and common constitutional traditions of member states. And he then went on and told them that citizens should be able to form their own opinions in a public space where there is access to reliable information from a plurality of sources with different views which can be expressed, where political discussions can be confronted, and where it's possible to disagree with one another. Powerful stuff indeed. Who in hell would disagree with that? But it's so brazenly out of touch with reality that I think many people would have found themselves scratching their head and going, where is this utopia that he's talking about? And none more so than myself and my colleague, former MEP Mick Wallace, who's also here today, who know the Commissioner well. And we knew him from our time in the Irish Parliament, and he never stood out then as a crusader for democracy. In fact, he was a member of successive governments which were entirely actually undemocratic in their nature. And his newfound interest in democracy actually was, kind of particularly uncharacteristic until you looked at the title of the debate that he was introducing, and it was called "The Hungarian Government's Drift to Russian-Style Repression, Legislative Threats to Freedom of Expression and Democratic Participation." In other words, in layman's terms, this is the ongoing standoff between the centrist parties which have ruled Europe for decades now, who call themselves liberal, and the so-called illiberal regimes, on the other hand, led by Hungary's President Viktor Orban. And then McGrath's words make sense, because the real reason why the EU leadership stands so staunchly in defending free speech in Hungary is that it's speech that they agree with. And it's an entirely different matter if you have speech which they don't agree with. And that is the context of the European Union's disinformation policy. It's the fundamental point that people have to understand. It has nothing to do with democracy. It's a tactic that they use for people they don't like. And first and foremost, and most importantly, it is to clamp down on dissent, on those who would have the audacity to challenge those people who are in power. And so we have this fable of the EU's official platform for its disinformation obsession, that our democracies are under attack from malign foreign actors who want to spread disinformation, to undermine our societies and our governments, to influence our elections, to put us all against each other and break down our unity. And to stand up to this terrible threat, we have to defend our democracy by cracking down on disinformation and promoting unity in the European Union. It's absolute and utter nonsense from start to finish. Of course, foreign interference exists. Of course, states have the right to defend themselves from outside influence seeking to undermine them for the benefit of themselves. But Russian bots didn't sway European elections. Their outcomes were very firmly determined by domestic matters. Look, we all know that all states do propaganda. But what I found when I was a member of the INGA committee, which was the Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation, which I was the coordinator on the left group for 3 very long years, I can tell you. But from my experience on that committee, the problem wasn't propaganda that actually came from external sources or foreign governments. The problem was narratives domestically that they didn't agree with. And I suppose I have to be honest now and confess at this stage that I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm actually a Russian propagandist, believe it or not, according to a Ukrainian hit list or whatever. And the 2 reasons why I'm a Russian propagandist is I said 2 things. One, that the war in Ukraine was a NATO proxy war. And the second, that the people of Europe were suffering more than the Russian economy from the sanctions that Europe had imposed on Russia. Now, I happen to stand over both of those things still. But rather than engage with me on the content of those issues, on the fact that Stoltenberg came in here and told us that NATO provoked the war, on the pauperising reality for European citizens crushed under the cost of living issue, rather than discussing those issues with me and taking responsibility as the European leaders who brought them in, it's much easier to smear me as a Russian agent or a Russian propagandist. And that is what the European Union's disinformation policy is designed to do, to silence anyone who questions their narrative, the official narrative. And to do that, they even have a toolkit to whip us into line, to suppress certain kinds of speech and to manage the kinds of information that are allowed to circulate in our society. So if you question their COVID policy, you're an anti-vaxxer. If you criticise Israel's genocide, you're anti-Semitic. And if you argue for peace in the war in Ukraine, well, then you're a Kremlin stooge or something like that. That's basically what's going on here. And how the European Union is going to deal with that disinformation comes under the defence of democracy package. They used to call it when I was here. I mean, did you ever? It's just pathetic. It's even been rebranded worse now. It's the European Democracy Shield. I mean, where do these people get off? And the committee is even called the European Democracy Shield Committee. And you literally could not make this stuff up. And the whole basis of it is that ideas are now dangerous and they pose a fundamental threat to our democracy, allegedly. The public sphere, the media, social media, where our society learns about itself and public opinion is shaped. This is now a battleground. Words and ideas are weapons. And the European liberals are here to save us from that, to defend us from these outrageous attacks. And let's be honest about it, despite the fact that this has accelerated massively since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has always been a programme of repression by the European political establishment. And up until now, the toolkit has been kind of a soft form of repression, really. They had a number of tactics. You can read about them in the INGA report, which is the report of the old committee that I was on. But the approach at that time was kind of to do stuff like drown out dissenting narratives with propaganda in support of the official EU narrative. Now, when we do it, it's not propaganda, of course. It's called strategic communications because we're the good guys. But that was what they used to do there. Then they sought to co-opt social media platforms to de-rank narratives they don't like. And then they've pumped funding into these so-called fact-checking organisations to police online discourse. Now, we warned about this. They even toyed with the idea of making contradicting governments a crime. Did you ever? They had to back away from that one because that would be even a little bit too far to go. And you'd have to bring in legislation and a court case to deal with that. And this is where the European Union's 17th set of sanctions comes into play. Because what you have here is sanctions targeting disinformation, hybrid sanctions they call them. The first package was in December. We've had 2 more since then. And our great High Representative lauded these sanctions under the guise when she said, and she sternly vowed, that those who enable Russia face severe consequences. So the EU foreign ministers brought in a list of sanctions on 21 individuals and 6 entities who were responsible for hybrid activity, including disinformation. Now, what was this disinformation and who were these people? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because this is Russian disinformation. Now, a few of them were actually Russians, but there was also a German blogger, an EU citizen who was sanctioned, and there was a Turkish citizen who was a valid EU resident who was also sanctioned. He lives in Germany. And let's look at this case for a minute, and I hope I'm not labouring it, but we have time here and we have to use it to really spell out what is going on in this so-called European Union of democracy in action, as we took our pictures outside the sign outside of here. Because in that case, we have a person who's been subjected to an asset freeze and a travel ban on the basis that he was systematically spreading information which the EU said was false. Now, we don't know what that information was because nobody got to see it. But they said he disseminated the narratives of Hamas. But again, what narratives they were, we don't know. They said he created discord, and that he provided pro-Palestinian protesters, who are described as anti-Israel rioters, with an exclusive media platform. Now think about this. This sounds like the type of action that millions of European Union citizens agree with, trying to force their governments to end complicity with the genocide in Gaza. In fact, many people believe there should be a lot more discord created in Europe to deal with this. But even if you don't agree with that, you have to ask yourself the question, how in God's name is any of this linked with Russia? That's a tough one to sort of. Well, I'll tell you the answer to that one because they have it. Seemingly, pro-Palestinian action undermines the stability and security of the European Union or one or more of its member states. And sure, that's what the Russians are all about. We all know that. So therefore, pro-Palestinian activity is supporting Russia and you can be sanctioned. Now, I'm not being flippant about this. This is the actual reality of this. I don't know the facts of the case. Nobody does, because it hasn't been published. But what it looks like is a person who was involved, nothing to do with Russia, who was documenting German police crackdown on Palestinian protests, and in retaliation, the German authorities slapped them with an EU sanction. And if it can happen to them today, it can happen to you tomorrow. It is almost unbelievable, but you have to get on that page to realise the seriousness of what is at stake here. Now, in democracies, we're supposed to have a rule of law, don't we? God Almighty, you hear about it off and on off. In this place, you think it was their bread and butter. But that means if you want to punish somebody, you have to charge them with a crime. That crime has to be defined in law. Once you charge them, due process has to come in. They have the right to know the charges against them. They have a right to see the evidence. They have a right to a trial in open court, a right to defend themselves, a right to free speech that they can use there. And then the state can only impose a sanction when they've carefully considered all of those things beyond reasonable doubt. And not anymore. That's gone now. Depriving people of their rights based on rumours and innuendo is exactly what these hybrid sanction packages are about. It's as simple as that. I wouldn't normally be in the habit of quoting Politico, but sure, look, we'll break a habit seeing as we're here. When they even saw some of the dossiers, and they said one of the packets that had somebody sanctioned was 10 open source links with varying degrees of reliability. Another was 9, another was 4. Articles in publications like the Financial Times and Reuters were heavily relied on. Badly translated, probably AI translated articles from Russian and Ukrainian sources. One was a lifestyle magazine affiliated affiliated with the Russian government, but it generally talked about cookery rather than actually news and all this sort of stuff. There was even a woman who was sanctioned for performing a concert in Crimea. I kid you not. I mean, this wouldn't pass muster in a classroom, not to mind a courtroom, but this is what's being talked about as evidence in the European Union, evidence of Russian interference. No oversight. Civil servants draw up a list which is on the advice of the Commission and Member States, and then 27 EU foreign ministers go behind a closed door and vote to sanction you or not. And if you're targeted by an EU sanction, you don't hear the charges against you, you don't get a trial, you don't get a right to defence. You basically, the first thing you find out about this is a letter coming in your door telling you that your bank accounts have been frozen and that you're banned from entering or leaving the country. And the guy who was sanctioned in Germany, I'm just going to briefly read his account of that, because sometimes we bandy words around here about things like sanctions and they seem a bit depersonalised. Well, what does that actually mean to a real person? Well, this guy explained it, and he said, I haven't been charged with anything. I haven't stood trial. I haven't been found guilty of any crime. I'd no chance to defend myself. But the EU sanctioned me for my pro-Palestinian journalism and stripped me of my rights. I'm not allowed to buy food. I'm not allowed to buy medicine for my children. I'm not allowed to pay for my lawyer. I'm not allowed to leave the country I live in. I'm not allowed to enter the country I live in. I'm not allowed to get a job. I'm not allowed to make payments. I'm not allowed to receive payments. I'm not allowed to pay my rent. Every single time, for every single case, I have to submit a file and ask permission. And then I have to wait several days for approval. And in case any of you are feeling a bit sorry for him and think that you might send him a few bob just to help him out, well, I'd be very careful about that, because you too could then be sanctioned for the crime of circumventing a sanction from the European Union, and you could find yourself on a sanction list as well. Now, this kind of sounds like tin pot sort of stuff, but this is democracy now in the European Union, and it is the new repression, as Andrew had called it, because we have hybrid sanctions against EU citizens for exercising the very rights that Michael McGrath lauded in these buildings a number of weeks ago as being enshrined in our constitutions here. So what we see is, in their so-called battle between democracy and authoritarianism, the European Union is becoming incredibly authoritarian in their actions. It is an absolute abomination. And every foreign minister who sat in that room and voted for those sanctions should be called to account by the members in this House. And I really would urge MEPs who are here present to contact Michael McGrath and to make that point. There really has to be a concerted effort, and we'll probably deal with it in the Q&A in a minute. And I know, because I was there before him in the previous committee, I'd imagine life is very difficult for Fidias on the European Democracy Shield Committee, but this has to be made an issue there. It has to be made an issue in the Civil Liberties Committee, and I really think members here should coordinate their work in that, in terms of how it's going to be raised over the next period. I think there's also a need for a really serious joint effort from members to take legal advice and to look into whether this is something that could be taken to the Court of Justice on the basis of the general threat to all EU citizens' rights which exists from this. Now, obviously the problem with that is impunity. There's limits to what procedural challenges can achieve. But if there's no pushback on this, which is why this meeting is so important, then they're going to go further. There has to be broad political support built to challenge what's happening here. You've got to go from this and organise in your home countries to talk about this. You've got to speak in your communities and tell people what's going on, and that it's a threat to them and it's going to get worse. Honestly, there is really a very small window left to do anything, and it's crucial that we organise to do something before that window closes. So, in conclusion, this is not just about speech. It's really about the fundamental right of expression, the most fundamental right we have and tool we have as citizens. We have to be able to challenge our governments to change their policies. But that's what's in the firing line now from all of this stuff. You mightn't care about whether someone was silenced for pro-Palestinian speech or whatever. That's not really important. You don't have to agree with the issues there, but you have to recognise the danger of what's going on here. Because if it's them today, it's you tomorrow. And tomorrow is already here. When I was on the Inga committee for those 3 years, every single thing they didn't like, they called it Russian interference or Chinese interference or Iranian interference. Didn't matter who it was. So it was anything. Catalan independence movement, Russian interference. The peace movement, Russian interference. Eurocritical politics, you name it, whatever it was. That's the name of the game here. So if you care about the ability to do opposition politics in Europe, you have to care about this issue. And that's what this meeting here is about. It's a platform to begin to expose that, because the first task in changing something is understanding that it's broken and giving information about that. And that's what we're doing here. And that's why this is important. But it's not enough on its own. We've got to go from here, get the message out and organise for the right to hold our governments and our leadership into account and not be conned by the spurious ideas that what's happening in our societies and the very valid criticisms that our citizens have is somehow the product of infiltration from out external sources. So I leave you with that. Let's go out there and take them on, because literally our right to survive is at stake here.
Thank you very much, Claire. So now, let's go to the introduction of Andrew. Andrew Lowenthal is a lifelong campaigner for digital civil liberties and free expression online. He is from Australia, also a German citizen. He is a former fellow of Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, the Harvard Film Studies Center, and the MIT Open Documentary Lab. He co-founded and served for almost 18 years as executive director of EngageMedia and Asia Pacific Digital Rights and Open Technology non-profit. In recent years, as recession in civil liberties has accelerated, Andrew founded and has been leading a new non-profit organization, LiberNet, which pushes back against democratic backsliding on free expression online and against all forms of digital authoritarianism, whereas threats to individual privacy, biometric ID schemes, electronic surveillance, and so on, and things like this, he will speak about. He wrote a lot about what he calls and we call censorship industrial complex, in particular with an investigative journalist alongside Matt Taibbi on Twitter Files, which you, I think everybody know, and exposed how anti-disinformation arrangements between governments and social media platforms have become a censorship apparatus aimed not at foreign disinformation, but against domestic population. I invite Andrew to address the Parliament. I'm honored to welcome Andrew Lowenthal at the European Parliament. Andrew, please, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ondřej. Thank you, Fidias, as well, and also their teams for bringing me here. It's great to be able to speak to you all here in Brussels. As Ondřej mentioned, I spent a lot of my career working in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, and repressive regimes like Myanmar, authoritarian countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, regions like West Papua, working with people on the ground to defend freedom of expression online. I had imagined, or in my mind, knew that whilst the West had its warts, for the most part, free speech was something that had been essentially kind of baked into the system and that was more or less not radically under threat. Come 2016, 2017, and Brexit and Trump, whilst of course there had been issues prior to this as well, as exposed by people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, we saw a radical acceleration in the West of censorship, essentially, and a betrayal of what were some of the most professed values of places like the European Union. In some ways, I've started to feel that this is actually worse than what I saw working in places like Myanmar or Indonesia, because there often they didn't have the technical means to have a kind of totalizing system of speech repression, whereas the difference with in the West is that much of those means are very much available, and in fact those technical affordances are only increasing in capability every single day with AI and other things that we will talk more about. I was particularly blindsided because as someone who had spent a couple of decades very much embedded in the left, I had always thought of the right as being the anti-free speech, the censors, the authoritarians, etc. But what has happened, and I will kind of go through this, that will, I think, illustrate this, is that actually much of progressive and liberal culture was Trojan horsed to justify censorship, and actually much of the new support for censorship comes not from the right, although there is certainly significant elements there, but actually from the left. And it's a constant source of disappointment after spending more than 2 decades of my life deeply dedicated to a progressive project, to see just how much people in that sphere have kind of given up, not only given up, but in actual fact turned against free speech and work, if not kind of to stay silent, but actually against it explicitly through things like the kind of NGOs and academic institutions that claim to be countering disinformation, but actually often turn out to be censorship apparatuses working in concert with government. So what we saw after Trump and Brexit is really a radical acceleration of this anti-disinformation crisis. So recently my nonprofit LiberNet, we did an analysis of more than 1,100 US federal grants made to counter disinformation or content controls initiatives, including things that might be kind of referred to as kind of counter hate initiatives. Of those 900 grants that we ended up including in a database that we analyzed, essentially before 2016, there are an absolute handful of grants. Essentially, a dozen, 2 dozen at most, starting from 2008, 9, 10. 2017, you see this massive increase in funding for federal funding, US federal funding for this work, up until really 2024, where obviously the new Trump administration, which has its own free speech issues, cut a large number of these programs. So prior to 2016, really, this disinformation crisis didn't exist. The justification of people who are working to counter so-called disinformation is that the Trump election and Brexit essentially prove that were won on the basis of disinformation. I think actually that theory has been thoroughly debunked. And what this was, in actual fact, was a kind of panicked response by liberalism in crisis to a kind of populist wave. And so I think oftentimes people think that this is a kind of left-wing initiative, this kind of censorship apparatus. Certainly people on the right describe it as that. Actually, I would say it's a kind of centrist, corporatist initiative of both the centre-right and the centre-left. And so, if you look where its origins and the governments where it really took root, in the UK it took root under the Tories, under the Conservative government. In the EU, it's been under von der Leyen and the EPP. In Australia, it was under a Conservative government. In Ireland, under a centre-right government, if I'm correct. Et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there are the exceptions, or maybe they're equally weighted, of the Arderns, the Jacinda Arderns, and the Justin Trudeaus, et cetera. But this is not a kind of left-right thing. It's kind of an authoritarian left-right centrism versus a kind of left-right populism on both sides, and it seeks to counter both of them rather than to censor opinions, rather than to actually come up with solutions to real questions and challenges and the crisis that seems to be engulfing the EU by the day. So of those grants that we analysed, there was about $1.5 billion of US federal money. So imagine that this is only one part of the money. There's EU money, there's private philanthropy, etc., that is also going in. So you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar endeavor over, a decade or more. Actually, a lot of that money, the biggest grant actually was for almost $1 billion that came from the Pentagon to an organization called Paraton to basically do industrial scale or military scale counter disinformation work. But much of the other money came from things like the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, USAID, which probably people who are on the internet too much heard a lot of kerfuffle about what USAID were funding. I would actually say they were one significant part of a much larger system of US government funding. And actually, of the 900 grants that we analyzed, more than 600 of them came from the US State Department. So whilst they weren't the kind of largest share by pure monetary spending, actually by internal effort, they represented the lion's share of that money. In fact, some grants were as low as $727 that went to the Atlantic Council, which is has a $60+ million annual budget per year. Very much works in cooperation with NATO around the corner. So you will have to explain to me why a $60+ million organization needs $727 in additional funding from the government. So when we think about essentially, is this a kind of organic or inorganic phenomena, I think we need to, I can't exactly give you that answer. What I can tell you is that most of the money is coming top down, essentially, from the government and from private philanthropy. Without all of this money, this kind of anti-disinformation moral panic would essentially be impossible. It would just be a kind of scattered kind of network of non-profits doing this work. And I say that at the same time to say it's not like there is no disinformation. This is real. There is a certain amount of a problem, and there's certainly also a certain amount of a problem of hate speech on the internet. The issue is that the problem is being massively over-amplified by cynical actors, essentially, who are trying to leverage the crisis or amplify this into a crisis for their own political purposes in an endeavor to essentially squash their political opposition or to hobble their political opposition. So this is essentially a political weapon. In the same way that, Trump might shout fake news at media outlets, etc., this is the kind of liberal version of shouting fake news to try and hobble your opposition. And again, it very much kind of takes the form or kind of works through this kind of progressive Trojan horse. So you'll see things like, it's a very interesting event that happened in Australia where Nita Jankovic, who people may know, was the head very, very briefly of something called the Disinformation Governance Board that was set up as part of the Department of Homeland Security, an intelligence and security agency, the biggest one of the United States government. She spoke in Australia at Trades Hall, at a union hall, essentially kind of touting this censorship as a kind of progressive project. In times gone by, when I used to go to that same venue for meetings around corporate power or labor organizing or whatever it might be, if someone had turned up from a security or former employee of a security and intelligence agency who wasn't a whistleblower to that same very agency, but actually someone who still essentially backed their mission, they would be kind of heckled out of the room. But this is the new kind of situation where how is it that what has happened to the culture of the left, essentially, that these things essentially go uncommented on and people can essentially present themselves as progressive actors when in actual fact they're former employees of the security and intelligence apparatus.
Is it okay if I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
So the question that I want to ask to down the conversation is how you spoke about the European Union that is doing this censorship, and you spoke about the United States that is doing this censorship. I want you to explain me exactly what are the methods that they are doing. You explain a briefly.
I'll be doing that in my speech.
What?
I'm answering some of that in my speech.
Yeah, I have that.
And he probably has that as well.
Sure. So I'll give you, I'm not sure how fun I can make it. I'm going to do my best. But to give you a couple of examples of like what that looks like in practice. So Twitter files, it sounds like people are fairly up to speed on in terms of what happened there. Matt Taibbi was the first journalist brought in to look at those files. And essentially, as he went through them, he found all these academic institutions, kind of centers at universities, NGOs and philanthropic organizations, and he didn't know what all of this was. It wasn't his world. He put out a call saying, is there anyone out there who can help me because of my because of my background working in that NGO space, raising money from liberal philanthropic organizations, etc. I was like, I know what a lot of that is because I know a lot of those organizations and some of those people. So essentially we went through and we found hundreds really of these organizations. To give you an example of like what one of them looks like and what it did is something called the Virality Project. So this was something that emerged out of another initiative called the Election Integrity Partnership. There's a lot of characters in this. It's a little bit Game of Thrones. So if people get lost, then rewind and watch it again afterwards.
I like that you became a YouTuber. You're thinking about the online video.
That's right. I'm trying to help you out here. So the Election Integrity Partnership was set up literally in the words of a man called Graham Brookie, who runs something called the Digital Forensics Research Lab, which is part of the Atlantic Council, that they'd just been asked by DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and CISA to set up an election integrity partnership, right? So a request from Security and Intelligence Agency. They did so with other organizations called Graphica, which does a lot of kind of online social mapping, digital cartography, you might call it. Another organization called the University of Washington, and another one called the Stanford Internet Observatory. They had partners in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and several others. So the biggest, almost all of the biggest social media platforms on the planet, and they had a JIRA system to essentially flag to their big tech partners what they saw was problematic or content or misinformation. And in that project, they literally gave recommendations to the big tech platform saying, we recommend that you take this down, we recommend you label it, etc. So that's an example of government establishing a proxy network of NGOs and academic institutions to then flag content to social media for takedown. That initiative became something, or followed on to become something called the Virality Project, which was essentially aimed at so-called countering vaccine misinformation during the COVID period. And they literally gave advice, and this is emails that we found in the Twitter files, that these platforms should consider true stories of vaccine side effects as misinformation. So true stories in their rubric were misinformation, again, from a network founded out of security intelligence apparatus. So a simple question, the platforms could say no. The platforms could say no.
They went with the suggestions and they censored all the information.
Well, they didn't censor everything. They censored some and they didn't censor others. They also, there's evidence to say that they knew that there was kind of government involvement in the project. There were people from CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, on the flagging platform as well. So, you would make a decision. So sometimes they push back and sometimes they didn't. So it isn't necessarily, I would agree, always a problem that the government is kind of pushing for the censorship. It's also a problem of the culture in the tech companies, in academia, in NGOs, that they see this just by default as legitimate content for censorship. Because they just couldn't imagine, or they had been taught not to be able to imagine that actually maybe there might be some legitimate criticism here. And I'll give you an example of very legitimate criticism. And I will also note that actually Australia just last week, Australian government now doesn't recommend the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine for under 18s because the benefits don't outweigh the harms, right? So this is completely counter to, and we also no longer recommend the AstraZeneca vaccine. The J&J was pulled off the market as well. There's a swathe of European countries that don't recommend all the vaccines for everyone. So there was always a certain amount of problems, and any criticism was always valid discussion for people to kind of weigh up. Here you had people essentially going out of their way to say there will be zero criticism of this product and run cover for essentially big pharma and big corporations in coordination with the government. So one example of that, there was a man by the name of Martin Kulldorff. He was co-author of something called the Great Barrington Declaration, which some people may have read. It was signed by hundreds of thousands of medical and public health professionals, scientists, etc. Basically demanded a kind of more focused protection approach to the pandemic rather than a kind of sledgehammer, lock everyone down, etc. approach. He made a tweet that said essentially that if you've had COVID or you're a child, you don't need to take the vaccine. So again, this is now in Australia, at least for the children, the recommendation of our own government. The people at the Virality Project, which are mostly, not to be ageist, interns and students, not public health professionals, flagged that tweet. It was labeled by Twitter, and then Dr. Martin Kulldorff had or Professor Martin Kulldorff, I should add, his professor at Harvard University, not that you need to have those credentials to be able to speak. He was also actually on the CDC vaccine subcommittee specifically related to the COVID vaccine, so this person knew what they were talking about. So he had his tweet labeled, and then he had his Twitter handle suspended on the basis of kind of graduate students flagging it because it didn't say what the CDC was saying. So he didn't say what the government was saying. So essentially he had his account temporarily suspended. So this is how it kind of tended to manifest in real life. It's not that they always said yes when the things were flagged to them, but there are certainly very important instances where it was.
So can you explain a bit the difference between the United States response and the Europe response? It was the same thing?
No, definitely not. And I don't know as much about the Europe response as about the United States response. And actually that is some of the research that we're doing now, is trying to map most of the NGOs that we mapped and academic institutions that we mapped originally for this expose on the censorship industrial complex were 90% American. And at that time, actually, we only mapped, I think we released a map of about 50 or 60 and write-ups of about 50 or 60. And I looked at that map now, and it just looks hopelessly naive, because now we've essentially mapped more than 1,000 organizations and more than 500 funders that have contributed in one way or another to this anti-disinformation space. Which isn't to say, again, that all of it is this kind of nefarious censorship work. Some people are kind of doing what might be considered legitimate work, or they're not necessarily working. Many of them, probably most of them, aren't working directly in concert with the government, but they are essentially more or less having the same approach, which is there are people who are experts and they understand what's going on in the world both now and forever into the future, and they can decide what is true. And then there are the kind of plebs and the masses who don't understand anything and need to be guided by these kind of enlightened ones. So it's essentially a highly elitist understanding of how knowledge production and works, and how truth is aimed closer at. And I think that is part of the problem. It's not necessarily just these kind of heavily coordinated initiatives. It's a kind of overall ideology, which is that the people are dangerous and the experts are here to rescue us. And actually, the part of these initiatives are there to protect the experts from criticism, even when they get things wrong, which I think is the exact opposite of what you should be doing. Experts are fallible. We need experts, but we need experts who can learn and adjust and advance knowledge and take in feedback, not kind of just tell people to be quiet and sit down every time they hear something that they don't.
This is what science is just proving the other person wrong and proving your theory. So we need to allow this to happen. Yeah. But do you have any closing kind of remarks?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of where to, I think because a lot of this stuff is being not entirely defunded, but in part defunded in the United States, and it's obviously been very much kind of under pressure and dismantled in somewhat by the Trump administration, and we probably will get at some point to the kind of Trump administration's own free speech problems, but I don't think they're not under this rubric. There's a different rubric that they are essentially using to clamp down on free speech. A lot of the momentum has shifted across to the EU. It's shifted across to the UK. In the EU, I think particularly states like Germany are really kind of the vanguard and the forefront of this new system. I don't understand in some ways why they keep persisting with this approach, because part of the reason Trump got in, I would argue, was because of the crackdown that the Biden administration had on free speech. It brought people like Elon Musk into the Trump camp. And I would say, stop doubling for the EU needs to stop doubling down, even for their own sake, because I think this is a failed strategy. It's not actually going to work. I think there needs to be a quite honest conversation or frank conversation within kind of progressive liberal left circles about what went wrong. Like, why has there been this turn against free speech? I think a lot of the now pro-Palestine activism is understanding that now that their free speech is being impeded upon, that maybe there will be a kind of drift back to go, okay, well, we need to stand up for free speech all the time, not just when it's convenient for us. But I also think we need a whole bunch of new outlets and platforms, because at the moment we're all corralled into just 3 or 4 or half a dozen at most, perhaps, platforms to express ourselves, and we really need hundreds and thousands of different federated social media platforms so that they can't just be controlled or shut down by the government and bureaucrats at their whim.
So to summarize your end is like you said the United States is in a better direction than we are.
On this specific issue, it has new free speech challenges, which aren't so much the remit of this conversation, but I don't want to come across as like, yay, Trump has rescued us and everything. Free speech now reigns in the US, because there's a whole new problem there. But the rubric of weaponizing, countering disinformation to shut down speech, yes, that has taken a serious blow, certainly not over in the United States.
Okay.
Well, I think we should thank Andrew for his speech. We should also thank him for surviving the questioning by Fidias. Fidias has to question because, he is the member of the Democratic Shield Committee, which is the only shield of our democracy against all the enemies of the European Union. Thank you for the important work you are doing. The Greek told it that you can return from the battle with a shield or on a shield. So I hope that democracy will not return on a shield from all these battles.
It's not very good news in Democracy and Shield. We are not the majority in the Democracy and Shield that we want freedom of speech, guys. So that's why we're doing these events, to convince people.
I would like to say a few remarks. Andrew, I really liked what you were saying about the right and left discourse. I was for 20 years a lawyer, I would say a classical liberal, who would clearly say that putting sanctions, depriving of property, someone without a due process of law is wrong. But now we are seeing it is happening in the EU. I have been taught in school that we have to, in law school, that we have to be very careful about the meaning of words. We were taught the famous Lord Denning speech, quotation from Alice when the Humpty said that it is about who is to be master when interpreting words, and this is something very dangerous. But now we have a commissioner who says that we are protecting free speech, whereas we are violating free speech by these actions. And it is very wrong. As many of our Czech colleagues know, I was for a short time in the Pirate Party because I liked that they said they are protecting free speech on the internet. But when I went to the internet and told that the COVID vaccines do not provide collective immunity, I was kicked out of Pirate Party. So what is it? And now they are telling us we are far left or far right or far something, whereas we are basically the same classical liberals we were all the time, and I think this is a bad thing. Andrew, it was very interesting also speaking about the NGOs. I wonder if somebody who's getting governmental money from government is any longer a non-governmental organization. Well, it is a governmental organization. And I think if these people are trying to govern us, they should be elected, or they should not govern us. It is bad enough if we sponsor them from our government or EU government, but sometimes they are sponsored by US government from the US aid. Well, thank you for this. Well, I think it is a time to come up with the foreign influence laws, not the ones that Orban has, but the one the US has from 1938. They are basically the same, but of course US FARA law is good, and Orban FARA is bad. Well, this is something to speak about. Concerning COVID, well, everybody remembers the issues. We were in the WHO, and we told the guys there, please do not use the word disinformation, because people are, well, vaccinated against being prevented from speaking about science. So speaking about disinformation just moves many people from trust and doesn't create the trust at all. To the contrary, WHO should go do an after-action report and say this was a good recommendation, this was a bad recommendation, we admit it, as Denmark did, for instance. Perhaps they will do it. We asked them as European Parliament. It is a necessary point which needs to be made after COVID if we are to support somehow the WHO. To the contrary, one thing I have to say concerning COVID and WHO, they are target of disinformation. Why? Because the local governments who did all the lockdowns and closed the schools, they say now it was WHO which forced us to do it. But the WHO people said, and they are right, that they never forced any state to close the schools. It was the local guys who did. It was Andrej Babiš in Czech Republic. It was other governments around the world. So we need to say who is responsible for policy, and no interference from this debate should be tolerated. Ladies and gentlemen, I was 11 in 1989, and before then, as a small child, we were told that the murderers from the Wall Street are going to throw all the nuclear bombs on us, and only the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact is protecting us from them. It was quite fun when I studied in Missouri, United States. I told the guys, well, you are the murderers from the Wall Street. You were going to kill us. Agreed. Well, they were surprised. Now everybody is telling us that the Russians are going to kill us, and the murderers of the Wall Street are the only protections against them. Well, it makes somebody think, and I think that at least we need to discuss about these things. And the free discussion is the program for our next hour, and I leave now the word to Fidias to guide us through this process. Thank you very much.
I want to say some kind words for the people sitting next to me. I think Ondřej is one of the humblest MEPs guys here in the house. I love him. We spend a lot of time together, and I'm happy to say that I'm his friend, and we are in the fight together. So it's very beautiful to join forces, because one person cannot do a lot of these things. And I want to thank you guys both, because I think you equipped us with some tools and some better narratives to explain this to our people, to the voters and all this stuff. And I want to say one optimistic point. Here in the European Parliament, like 2 months ago, we did another event with Jeffrey Sachs. This event, I just filmed it and we uploaded it on my social media. And it got 300 million views across all platforms, on TikTok and all this stuff. I was elected in my country as the most voted member of the European Parliament, which is kind of stupid, because I said to everyone that I don't know anything and I will learn, no political positions and all this stuff. But this is an evidence that the world is changing. We can control the narrative, and all this stuff that you spoke about, the billions of dollars going to NGOs and all this stuff controlling the narrative, they are doing it with the old way. They're controlling the media, they're controlling all this stuff. So if we push this narrative that we believe in, is not like to the social media in the new way, it's more optimistic that we can introduce these ideas to the voters to be more informed the next time that they vote. So I think we can do this if we use these new tools, the short form content on YouTube, podcasting and all this stuff to introduce these ideas that we talked about in the people. So yes, I'm very excited, and let's have a Q&A.
And please be short, because 300 million of people might watch you. So 1 minute. Thank you.
So raise your hand, and we'll have you choose for the first two.
So far, I have no one to choose. Everyone,
yes, people are afraid. They heard 300 million in there. No, it doesn't. It needs to have a red light. You need to press that. Yes.
It's a bit different from the UN one. Okay. Yeah, so I know this is a bit different from, well, not entirely from disinformation, because at the end of the day, why are we upset about this? Because it means repression of free speech, right? So I thought I'd come and talk about what's happened to me in the EU, in the Council of Europe, and I appreciate Claire and the rest of the panel having me. So my name is Richard Medhurst. I'm an independent journalist. My parents used to work at the United Nations. So because I'm British, I live in Vienna though, and I've got permanent residency there. So when I landed at Heathrow in August, counterterrorism police came on the plane and arrested me. No badges, no ID, nothing. And one of them was in tactical gear, like I'm some armed criminal or something. And they arrested me for my journalism. And this is the first time in British history that they've ever done this. They used provision of the law, section 12(1)(a). It literally criminalizes opinions or beliefs. Those are the exact words. So you could also be held criminally liable for what someone else understands from your videos or your work. So yeah, they also deprived me of other rights. Like they said, you have the right to know why you've been arrested and the right to tell your family. And I said, can I know why I've been arrested? And they said, yeah, Terrorism Act, Section 12. What is that? So they wouldn't explain that to me. And then when I asked to call a family member or a friend, they also said, no, you're not allowed to do that. And I was like, you just told me. It's on video. They have all of this stuff, so we'll see it someday. But if it was almost like, some kind of insane comedy, hard to believe that it was happening. And they kept me for like 20 hours until they questioned me. So for like 20 hours, I didn't even know why I was there. And as I said, it was all because of my journalism. And they are putting terrorism laws above Article 10, which guarantees free speech. And in the UK, the adoption of the European Convention of Human Rights is the Human Rights Act. It's the same thing. Every EU member has done that, and Council of Europe member has done that. So despite Brexit, we still have the Human Rights Act because of Council of Europe. We still have free speech. But they're burying that in the favor of the terrorism laws. And I've been under investigation for like 9 months now, 10 months. No charges yet. So there's infinite investigation. They've extended it 3 times. So if I'm so dangerous, you need 6 counterterrorism police to come grab me off of the plane. Why do you need 10 months to find evidence, right? So that doesn't make any sense. That's also no due process, no correct. And they didn't even tell me I could have a lawyer. I had to bring that up, which is also interesting. And then in Austria, they basically told me to come to the immigration authorities. Now, like I said, my parents are UN diplomats, so I've lived in Vienna for a while, never been asked to come to the immigration authorities. I got the Brexit card and all this stuff. So I knew something was up, and then I come there and they explicitly threatened me to my face that they could take away my residency because of my reporting. Unbelievable stuff. And then when that was done, they had intelligence agents come in the room, serve me with a search warrant. They searched my person, my home, my studio. They took 20,000 euros worth of equipment or more. They came back the next day with papers like this much of stuff that they took, listed. So they're also putting your right to residency, your right to free speech. They're burying that in favor of terrorism laws. And once again, they've never used this kind of stuff. And here's the funniest part: is that in Austria, they didn't just say that it's like supporting terrorism. They said, I'm a member of Hamas. It makes me a member of Hamas. And I tried explaining to them they don't have Christian members in Hamas. It's not allowed. And they just wouldn't get it. And there's a higher court that actually found that they illegally raided me. They didn't have permission to raid a journalist's domicile or workplace and handle journalistic materials. But despite that, they're still investigating me, and I'm not getting my devices back. So it's like even when the courts are on your side, you're still not on your side. And I think it's a very, very dangerous precedent because these laws have never been used in this way before. And it's not just disinformation, it's terrorism. And I mean, this is like revocation of residency.
Claire, is it the person that you were talking about?
Yeah.
What?
Oh, no, that's not him. No, no.
He's not him. It's
oh,
a
no,
different
no,
case.
no, completely different. Yeah, no.
She was talking about someone else who got sanctioned. I haven't been sanctioned, but they've basically stopped my work. I mean, they took all my stuff. And just to give you an idea, like how vindictive it was, they even took things that don't have date on them, like Faraday bags, cables, adapters, things that have literally analog equipment. What are you going to do with that? So the message is very clear. We want to cripple your work. We want to stop you from reporting because we don't like you telling other people the truth. And this escalation that like Claire was talking about, that you are now part of this information campaign that we don't like. I mean, this is insanity, saying that I'm a Hamas member and stuff. And they try to like link me to everything else. They say weapons trafficking, like human trafficking, like with no evidence, right? There's no evidence for any of this. But they're still able to do it. And that's happened in an EU country.
You don't obey what Andrei said. He said to be short.
I tried to condense that as best as I could. So, yeah.
Well, I have a good news for you. I knew about another terrorist who had $10 million bounty on his head.
Oh, Giuliani?
And he happens to be a head of state, and now everybody likes him. So I wish you good luck. But I think the due process part is also important, and hopefully the courts work. We also need the political part to work. That's for me.
Yeah, just to finish on that note, the Foreign Secretary in the UK went and visited Giuliani, and you had the former head of MI6 on Sky News praising him and his people as resistance fighters. So they technically broke the exact same law, but no one is punished. So I find that very, very, very interesting, and that was after I was arrested. So very, very hypocritical. And I was one of the only people who covered Julian Assange's case. I was in court in London for years, and I saw what a political persecution of a journalist looks like in the UK. That one was with espionage, and now this one's with terrorism. So, it's definitely unprecedented and dangerous.
Everything was said.
So,
Can you say? I mean, he's a living example of exactly what we were talking about there, and this is serious, and it's coming to a town near you. If you're doing something that those in power don't like, you could be like Richard. It's terrifying stuff, and we need to wake up to it.
we should also bring anyone has a question, raise your hand, we're going to go with it, but I think we should also bring a bit the conversation to, me and Andrei, we went to Russia. We went to Russia to promote diplomacy. And also recently one person, he was here, a MEP from ECR, he went to Russia and they kicked him out, the group, because he went to Russia to promote diplomacy. So the question, because you guys are afraid to ask maybe, is to talk a bit about this Russia as a devil here. If you can talk, or if you can talk, elaborate a bit more, why you think this is happening, how we...
I think one of the interesting things is that one of the first things that did happen in terms of kicking off this anti-disinformation panic was essentially Russiagate in the United States, that Trump was essentially elected with Putin's help, which turned out to be based on this fabricated Steele dossier from the Clinton campaign, etc. And that was, then we had 3 or more years essentially of the media spreading what was disinformation, out and out disinformation, and I think this is
it's not disinformation when they do it.
Well, I think this is the thing, and I think that the biggest disseminators of disinformation are the people who are screaming disinformation at other people, and I think that's one of the difficult things that is very hard to kind of get across to a lot of people, is that the biggest and the most important and the most dangerous disinformation agents are actually the people who say they are countering disinformation. So we had that one example related to so-called countering vaccine misinformation, which was, true stories, etc. But, another one would, and if Glenn Greenwald was here, I'm sure he would talk about it as well. The Hunter Biden laptop, that was also called Russian disinformation by the media on the basis of a letter from more than 50 former intelligence officials that said it was had all the classic hallmarks of a Russian information operation. That turned out to be completely untrue. It was a real laptop. It was known at the time to be a real laptop. The Washington Post and the New York Times and essentially all the mainstream media have now acknowledged that it was a real laptop. One of the very interesting things about that campaign to suppress that New York Post story a few weeks before the 2020 election is that 2 months before its release, the Aspen Institute, it's a very large think tank in the United States, held what they called a tabletop exercise to essentially practice what they would do if in the, strange coincidence, a Hunter Biden laptop talking about the Ukraine energy company Burisma happened to come to light just before the election. So they assembled the New York Times, they assembled people from Turner Media, that's CNN, the Washington Post, academics from Stanford, people from the Rolling Stone magazine, etc. And they essentially practiced page by page. You can see this in one of the Twitter files that was first released by Marco Schellenberger, and then I followed up on it with a second report, page by page, day by day, how they would respond 2 months in advance of this laptop becoming publicly known. So, and amongst the people who were part of that exercise was actually a counter disinformation organization called First Draft. So they actually, the woman who runs that, along with one of her co-authors, actually claims to have invented the term malinformation and essentially this whole misdis and malinformation rubric. So here you had essentially someone claiming to be countering mis and disinformation, to be running an organization dedicated to countering mis and disinformation, participating in a disinformation operation to suppress a true story that you could argue would have impacted, or arguably could have impacted, the outcome of an election in the most powerful country in the world. So again, I repeat, the people who are shouting disinformation the loudest are quite often the people who are spreading the most disinformation.
Well, just maybe to slightly add to that, think Andrew mentioned Russiagate and Brexit, and it was interesting when I was on the Foreign Interference Committee, this used to come up regularly when you were asked, and you asked them, well, could you give us any examples of actual Russian interference here? And they kept saying, Russiagate, 2016 US presidential elections, Brexit, that was it, even though they had all been scrutinised. Those two incidents had been scrutinised, not by me or not by some radical lefties or whoever, but by statutory state bodies in the two countries, and revealed that there was no such interference, or what interference there was had negligible input on either. And yet, time and again, in the European Parliament's reports, this completely wrong information was being written into the report, even though they knew, and everybody knew, that it was completely false. So what we have here, and what Russia has been, is they're a cover story. That's all they are. It's the same with the reason why they're trying to con you into spending billions of dollars of citizens' money on weapons of war rather than diplomacy and so on. You have to have a bad guy, because who in their right mind is going to agree to that? You have to make people fearful. So we call it Russian interference, but it's not without any evidence. It's to prey on fear and that is just absolutely insidious. It's a cover story to silence dissent at home. I mean, we used to make the point that truth is the first casualty of war, and it used to be always so. But in previous wars, you could at least put forward an anti-war position and be engaged upon on the merits of the argument. Now you don't need that. All you need to say, if somebody argues for peace or with you going to Moscow, oh, Kremlin bots, Russian agents, and they're either at worst in the pay of the Russians, or if not, well, they're just useful idiots, and that's the end of it. Those responsible for the mess we're in don't have to explain themselves because they can just dismiss you with a smear. And Russia is that smear, even though there's no basis to it, and even though the logic for all of us going forward on this Eurasian continent is to work cooperatively with each other, to invest in diplomacy and against war rather than the madness that we're empowering now. And information is part of that. It is a battlefield because information is power. So they're trying to mess with people's heads in relation to information. They're trying to distort the reality, make people afraid to disseminate information or to speak their opinions out loud. Because who wants to end up like Richard? Who wants to end up like other people and be smeared in that? No. So you say nothing and you sit back. And it's that sort of fear of being targeted, not just the targeting, that does that trick.
And we feel the bullying inside the parliament as well. We feel the bullying. There is so much bullying. Like when I speak sometimes in the Committee of Democracy and Shield after me coming from Russia, I hear people standing up and saying, you are a Russian asset, and leaving the room, members of the European Parliament. And I just ask the same question like the previous MP asked, and it's not a Russian asset. So it's like, it's a bit crazy. But we have...
just when we used to get up...
But I got very excited because we have a raise of hands. But okay, I'm joking.
What used to say to us was Moscow calling, and we used to shout back, Washington calling, Washington calling.
Okay, can you close your microphone and then continue. No, you. Thank you for asking a question.
Yes, actually, it's not a question. I worked 10 years in the European Parliament before being targeted myself by an incredible witch hunt as a Putin agent and so on and so forth. And so I would like to share as quickly as possible as I can 2 examples that I witnessed of how the so-called House of European Democracy is becoming totalitarian. So first, in 2016, I started in 2014. In April 2016, there was a Finnish Green MEP who was a former minister who wanted to show the movie of a famous Russian movie maker who was living in exile, Andrei Nekrasov, and who was famous for mainstream documentaries on Arte and so on and so forth against the Putin regime and so on. His last film was the Magnitsky Act, Behind the Scenes. He started he followed the official narrative, and he was totally convinced about it. But he found out that the official storytelling was impossible. There were too many contradictions. And so at the very last moment, his movie was cancelled. And so that Finnish MEP, I won't give the name, but she was forced to cancel the event in the European Parliament. And I think 1 or 2 weeks after, the film was supposed to be shown on Arte, so French, German channel, as you know, and it suddenly disappeared the day before it was supposed to be shown. And this is a big thing because that story led to the first Western sanctions against Russia in 2012, implemented by the US, John McCain, etc. And then during COVID, to a copy from the EU. So it was passed in December 2020. And so it was not possible to even have a debate on that story. And the second example, since I have to be as short as I can, so you talked about the the US Russiagate. Last year there was a EU Russiagate about a news portal called Voice of Europe. And I was targeted myself because of that. Because 3 of my former MEPs took part in debates, interviews, and there was, just to be also short, an article published by Eddie Wax in Politico. He interviewed several MEPs who took part in debates, and some of them were openly anti-Putin, anti-Russian, and they told him, well, we were free to express ourselves, we were not censored, we were not lectured, But okay, so the journalist sees there's something not good about it. The website was shut down immediately. And he concludes his article, well, but most of the MEPs went against the EU standard talking points. What are the EU standard talking points that you cannot discuss? And it's crazy because it was called Russiagate, but as far as I know, there was no Russian involved in that news portal, but Ukrainians who had either to leave their country or at least they couldn't. Their news portal, the channels were suppressed by Zelensky, and there were American citizens, there were British citizens working for that news portal. And all of a sudden, yeah, it's Russian disinformation, nothing to... Yes, I stopped here, sorry.
To comment shortly on this, I understand that countries which are at war actually are pursuing war propaganda. It was like this all the history. I understand it in Russia, I understand it in Ukraine. European Union is not at war, and for us it is necessary to openly discuss what is happening of the world and what are the proposed or possible ways how to work with Europe foreign policy. I understand that some people are for one path and other people are for different path, but the discussion needs to be allowed. Otherwise, we are ending in substandard, in wrong paths of policy. But how to achieve it? Anyway, if I may add to this with a question myself, I lived through COVID times. I had some expertise, I'm a lawyer, not a medical doctor, on pandemic matters. I would understand that I would be corrected or fact-checked by a professor of medicine, of public health. But it didn't happen so much. But what happened? All the fact-checking was done by people whom nobody knew in the area of public health before 2020. They started to be experts on public health in 2020, and all the media took them as fact-checkers. How is it possible? And now we see it also in international relations. The most vocal fact-checkers and media speakers are not professors of international relations. These are basically activists. How is it possible in both media and in social networks that people with no CV, basically, no experience, have so much attention and so much success?
It's a very good question, and it's interesting to contrast because if you dissented from government opinion, you were immediately told, well, you're not an expert, you're not an epidemiologist, you're not a vaccinologist, you're not, etc. But if you're a celebrity who is promoting the same product, that was completely acceptable, even though you knew just as little, if not less, than the people who might have been criticizing it. I mean, often what we found in the research we did was that what they were doing was basically checking the social media posts against government advice. So whether it was the CDC or any kind of other national health authority, which basically means they were there to enforce the government line, which again is why I'm so confused when it comes to progressives and the spaces that I used to hang out with, which were essentially about questioning authority and about questioning the government. And here were people getting behind essentially this idea of there is only one right answer. Even if it changes, the right answer is always what the government says. And I think history shows us that quite often governments get things wrong, and we don't have to look very far. You go back a day and you'll find a government being wrong, and go back 10 years, you'll find it 1,000 or 2,000 or many times. And it's completely antithetical to essentially the spirit of open debate and the way science itself works. So the question is totally right, whereas how did these people get into positions of authority where they would even be listened to? So why does Twitter listen when the Virality Project sends them a report or sends them a flag of a tweet or whatever it might be and says, oh yes, we'll take that down? And I think that was many years of networking and building relationships between social media and government and NGOs. I think it was a kind of big cultural process as well of essentially demonizing the idea of free speech as some kind of far-right phenomenon. It was essentially the progressives very, very quickly on the heels of pushing back against counterterrorism legislation where, progressives would say, you know what, I'm going to risk getting on this plane, that something might go wrong. My civil liberties are more important than your repression in this instance. And then, 5 seconds later going, actually, we must have safety at all costs and freedom is a dirty word. So, and I can't entirely explain to you how that happened. But what I can say is I think it was a combination of organic and an inorganic process, and the inorganic part is all of this government money that flowed into it to incentivize these NGOs and the academic institutions to essentially change the culture around speech to make it acceptable to start censoring people if they were the wrong kind of people, if they were, anti-vaxxers, Russian stooges, like you name it, there's essentially a pejorative for every single person who has the wrong opinion. And I think but I don't think it would have been possible because so much of this work is front-facing, right? You can't kind of take this content down without people noticing. You need to have these organizations, like there are obviously this kind of new style, which is more terrifying emerging, but essentially everything's been proxied through these social, cultural, political organizations. It also means you can reverse it in that you can convince those people that they're doing the wrong thing, and this is not in the spirit of what free speech and free expression and democracy, as we're told repeatedly, is meant to be about.
And here, if I may follow with question to Claire, because, I sort of understand when, for instance, a big pharmaceutical company which had $100 billion of dollars of profits of some product is spending money on social networks and media to promote the product and to promote the policies which lead to consumption of the product. I quite understand when somebody who manufactures arms proposes policies which leads to consumption of arms. But what I don't understand is actually the position of the left, because as I understood the concept of left, it is protection of interests of working people who produce the value and who end up in any wars as soldiers and who need to pay from their taxes all the costs of a failed, for instance, pandemic procurement or things like this, and who cannot escape all the things like lockdowns and things like this, whereas rich people can go to some other part of planet where it is freer. But what moves the left politicians via these directions, Claire?
It's an absolutely impossible question for me to answer. I mean, myself and Mick were in the left group for 5 years here, and we didn't really find too much leftism going on in it, to be honest. I think the left lost its way on an awful lot of issues. It would probably take us all afternoon to deal with that. But I think we're kind of talking about a bigger problem, if you like, because this is a whole of society shift. Like, how did we go from the place where, as Andrew said, a job in the media used to be, when you grew up, you wanted to be in investigative journalism because that's what journalism did. It held power to account. People wanted to be revolutionaries, to change society, to do all these things. But suddenly now we're in an era where, as you say, this fact-checking exists. And I think the reason why the people have no CVs and don't have the expertise is that they're the precisely right people for the job, because they don't want people with expertise. They want people who will promote the official narrative of that. That is their job. And that is the job that has become the job, if you like, of mainstream media, which has been gutted out of any sense of independence or so on, and is now really filled with, apparatchiks who, it's not the same media that it was, which is why people are moving away. Fidias is right, they're moving in the direction of social media. That gives us a huge opportunity, but obviously the powers that be, as we've discussed, are moving to clamp down on that space as well? And do we trust the arbiters of some US tech company to moderate our content any more than I trust Michael McGrath or the European Liberals? No, I don't. Because truth is different things to different people. And we have to move away from this thing that it's black and white, that things are black and white. They're not. They're grey, because your perspective changes. If I stand up on this table and look down at the floor, it's very different than if I lie on the floor and look at it. It's completely different. It doesn't mean I'm lying. And we used to have a democracy where what people had was an exchange of views. That's what we called it. But that doesn't happen now, because an exchange of views mean I say something, you say something, I agree with a bit you said, you agree with a bit I said, and then we both come away and we maybe change our position a little bit, or we differ, and we move on, or we both agree to disagree. And that was how we moved on and learned. But now you can't. If you deviate from the narrative, a label is put on you. And that's incredibly dangerous. And I think that's what's happening here. And the reason why they've probably got away with it is there has been, and it's probably linked to the left as well, there's been a hollowing out of activity in society, of activism, of ordinary people organising. We've been through hard times in Europe. There were the austerity years where people in our country were pauperised and made carry the debts of the bankers. We saw that in Greece and other countries as well. Life was difficult. We'd COVID where people were locked down and driven feckin' mad, So these things are there. So it's difficult for people to organise. But a lot of the trade unions lost their way. That space of activism was gone as well. So people aren't engaged and not involved. And if you're not engaged and you're not involved, well then, and you're coming home and you're tired from work or you're in a precarious job and you just want to flop in front of the television with a ready-made dinner and watch something else, well then they can get away with the stuff that they're getting away with. And that's kind of why we're in the place where we are. They've allowed get to that space where people aren't questioning. Now things are changing now. They're beginning to change through loads of things, through people watching a live stream genocide, through people in Europe pauperised under a massive cost of living crisis. People don't have the luxury of not doing anything. But the reason why they're attacking ideas is that, it was Malcolm X who said, the media are the most powerful organisation in the world. They have the ability to make the guilty innocent and the innocent guilty. And that's what they are. And whether that's on mainstream media or it's in social media, that is kind of the power that they use. And the only way you can contradict that, and we can use social media as much as we're still getting away with it, but ultimately that will probably be snookered as well. And there's no replacement for activism, for grassroots activism. And we probably have to get to a stage where big corporations or states don't control the media, that we have more cooperative or collective action between the people who work there, between the communities, between the people involved who police that information. Because we're the only ones, because information changes. Everybody knows the difference between a big lie, like for me saying, that is a chair, of me saying, well, I think that's a nice drink. And Ondřej goes, well, I don't. I think it's desperate. So, we can both have an opinion on something, and I think people know the difference. Oh, Mick wants to say it.
Okay, we have... let's go.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pavel Cimbal and I'm a journalist from Prague. And I have been deplatformed from Facebook recently. I'm not alone. There are many Czech citizens with the same problem. But now we have that DSA agreement and we do appeals against Czech Telecommunication Bureau, which should help us and which should solve this problem. But it's forwarded to Irish regulator and it ends there without any subsequent reaction and silence, and nothing happens at all. Do you have, as Irish citizen, some advice for us what to do with it?
Very good question, and it took about 5 years on the Libe committee in dealing with it's incredibly controversial. All I'll say is when we were in the Irish Parliament we dealt with this, and the Irish Data Protection Commissioner were absolutely dreadful. They had a little office over a kind of a chip shop in a rural town, and they were moderating and managing big tech for all of it. And the reason for this is that most big tech is based in Ireland originally, and the legislation that's in place. The GDPR legislation makes Ireland then, it's where you're domiciled that's responsible, your regulator there. Anyway, moving on, the Irish, and I'm not saying this because I'm Irish, because we were one of their staunchest critics, they did actually learn a lot. They did actually put a lot of money in, and I'm firmly convinced that the problem isn't just them, it's the way the GDPR itself was set up that makes it very hard for them to be held to account, because they lawyer up, they've massive resources that are there, they drag this thing out. So I don't think it's necessarily an Irish problem, and as I say, I'm not saying that. If I did, I'd say that, but I think it's the legislation itself. But because it was so controversial in getting that legislation through, they'll never look at it again, because they feel they wouldn't even get it to be as much as it is, you know. But we can talk about it in the pub later, because I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hello, good afternoon. I've listened to you very carefully, and you answered partially my question. But what are we going to do about this? You were talking about COVID. Damage has been done. We all know it. Then you've been talking about vaccines. We knew it's wrong because I work as a critical care nurse, so damage has been done. There's lots of people left harmed, and now they're completely invisible for the system, right? There was a young man talking about his case. Damage has been done. No one been punished. Now, it's been too long now. People are depressed. They actually resigned from jobs. The families are broken. And if you have a little bit strength to talk and fight, then you will be labeled as the Putin agent or whatever we all know been through. So you actually said, and you're correct, I blame big media as well, and also Ursula von der Leyen and government. But you have 720 members here, but maybe quarter of them are normal. The rest of is actually not fighting for people. They've been elected by people. They're supposed to fight for the country they've been voted for, and they're not doing that. So what would you advise to people to do to fight in normal way, to survive and open the eyes for the other people? Because it's been too long, as I said, we all been through, and I would say the strength is actually running out, and we cannot wait until the EU will be completely broken down, because I'm sure our lives will be much more damaged. Thank you.
Very good question, and I mean, I think it sort of relates to the fact, in my opinion, that European politics is becoming more like the USA, where there's a complete disconnect between the citizens and those who are elected. You basically, you know, the lobbyists, he who pays the billions gets the president, and that whose policies are implemented regardless of what the people think. And the European Union, who has 60,000 official registered lobbyists here in Brussels, not to mind all the unofficial ones, they're the ones who've corralled the Commission, which is the one with the power here. That's who they listen to. They're completely disconnected from the citizens, and many of the MEPs are as well. In many countries, only a tiny amount of people vote. The Parliament itself doesn't have a huge amount of power, and it's deliberately structured like that to put a barrier between the citizen and where those decisions are being made. So they've taken power from member states, from national governments, and there's creeping developments to try and take more and more, to have decisions made by majority, which for small countries and that will be a nightmare, because you'd have the big players deciding. That's the trajectory that the European Union is on. And the only way around it is that you can only dig where you stand. I can't go and change the situation in Cyprus. I've never been to Cyprus. Do you know what I mean? You've got to be organised. So in the Czech, you've got to start where you stand. And everybody can do something every day. It is about educating, agitating, organising. People who are here go home and tell 10 of their neighbours what they heard, develop them to Richard's case or whatever, or to the information Andrew gave. And people go, slowly. It's not enough, but there is no alternative around from that on the ground organising, you know.
I mean, I'll only add that I actually think we're in a better position than we were 2 or so years ago. I kind of actually think of the darkest hour in some ways as being around 2022-ish. And I think a lot more people now understand this system than they... I've basically worked in and around issues of like propaganda and since I was like in my late teens and doing protests and etc. around all this kind of stuff. And I was totally blindsided by COVID, believed everything for the first, 6 to 12 months and then was going, what's going on? Things are just not adding up here. There's so many contradictions and hypocrisy. And I think that a lot of people were still operating on what I kind of refer to as kind of an Iraq war model of propaganda and censorship. And we hadn't updated to this new kind of networked post-industrial system that we see now of the shadow banning, the down ranking. You can't kind of see it as clearly as you used to be able to kind of see the propaganda and the censorship. And I think now people have a much better understanding of what that looks like. And I think that censorship is very costly. And I think this system is extremely costly. And you don't do it flippantly. You don't spend this amount of resources if you're not trying to essentially prop up a system that is essentially faltering. So I think the system itself is very, very weak. And that's why you essentially have this kind of lashing out to kind of try and put this genie back in the bottle, because the kind of centrists can see that they're losing their grip on things. People are unhappy. There's a lot of problems. There are a lot of crises. They seem to refuse to want to address them. I don't entirely understand. Like a lot of this could be solved by addressing some of the kind of complaints that a large majority, at least very large minorities, have of their current situation, whether it's around cost of living or others, unless they just believe that they cannot solve them. And so the repression is the only solution that they think they can come up with. So I think that if I can kind of do a positive takeaway, I think that people have a better understanding of like how this new system of kind of managing public opinion works. And I think that it's happening because the system itself is quite weak, which is essentially an opportunity for change.
If I may take my stupid YouTuber hat for a second and just become a politician to answer your question, yes, I think there is a big disconnect between the people and the people leading, the politicians. And I don't know, my kind of philosophical take on this, I think we should try more kind of direct democracy. So this is something that I'm practicing with the voters in Cyprus. I have an app. So a lot of the stuff that I'm voting here in the European Parliament, the voters that elected me in Cyprus, anyone can download and vote what I will vote in the European Parliament. And slowly, I kind of vote what the people want, in a way. And this is what the politicians should do. Not always, when it's about basic things. So this is kind of one solution that I came up with. Maybe it's a step in the wrong direction, but it's definitely a step forward. Yeah. So we have another 2 questions, Andrei said.
Hello to everybody. My name is Jan Skalický. I'm from Czech Republic. I'd like to thank you to all of us, to all of you, for this discussion about, let's say, new repression and policy in disinfo policy in European Union. To be quicker, I'd like to ask you, Ondra, to translate my question, because it will be much more quicker for me to say it in Czech language.
Come on, you speak good English.
No,
try.
For me, it will be much easier. Ondro, ta diskuse tady, která je venku.
Quite hard to translate. The thing is, Jan says that the world is changing. We are on the verge where many people don't trust the mainstream, trust the opposition discourse. But he asks when, according to your opinion, it will break, and when and how will it happen? Do you have any expectation?
I mean, I don't think I try not to make predictions. I mean, I think it's breaking all the time. I don't think there's one singular moment. I think actually you've seen a huge number of ruptures in the past few years where people just stop believing. I mean, I think that is what a lot of the populist movements are. Is that people essentially saying we don't believe what you're saying anymore. So what it looks like when it reaches a critical mass, I don't know. I mean, some people would say what it looks like when it reaches a critical mass in the United States is what you're getting now. That might not be what a lot of people want. but it may well be something uglier first before it becomes something more beautiful. I mean, I think that so many avenues are being kind of shut down for what would otherwise be a cooperative or kind of cogent discussion about where to go and how to proceed, that I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I don't think it's going to be some easy solution. It's going to be things breaking one after the other until hopefully we hit a positive critical mass rather than a negative one. But I think to go with what Claire was saying, I mean, I think it's a lot of on the ground work and organizing to essentially get us into that much better position. And I think we already are, because I think people understand much more how this kind of new system works, but also at the same time, AI is already here. A lot of the system already uses that. So there's going to be new forms of repression and propaganda and kind of distortion of reality. And I think that things are, there's no easy solution or easy answer is what I'm saying. It's all in the struggle.
Thank you very much. Now I have to conclude because I have a message that another group is waiting from 1700. Thank you very much. Thank our guests, Andrew, Clare. Thank you very much. Thanks to Fidias who co-hosted with me this seminar, and thanks to everybody of you for attending.
We love you.